All right, and we're back. And now in this session, we're going to talk about HTTP verbs. Chris Fonsi, Greg Ruiz. Yeah. Let's have some fun.
All right. So verbs represent level 2 on our journey towards nirvana.
No, it's not the journey to nirvana. We're just putting forth the best practices that come as part of the REST specification.
Absolutely.
No, there's a lot of good things in REST, and HTTP verbs are one of those. The really nice thing about looking at HTTP verbs as representing the various create, read, update, and delete type operations that we would normally do as programmers is that a lot of the syntax and semantics and so on are already there. Right.
Absolutely.
So anybody who has at least a general understanding of HTTP, which we would mostly have to do in order to be able to use APIs to start with, can readily apply this kind of thing to the CRUD type operation.
Right, and that's what I was going to point out, and that is exactly what we are so used to. We're used to calling it CRUD, but really the HTTP verbs they correspond one-to-one with that concept.
They pretty much do. So for example, if we're looking at a collection of dogs, we can see, for example, that with post we would create a dog. Get, you would list a collection. Seems pretty straightforward. Put, we could actually replace that collection with a new collection if we wanted to. Or if we use delete, then we could just delete the entire thing.
Right, and as you're pointing out, it's not just the collection. It could be an individual item within the collection as well, an individual resource. So it's across the board, whether we're talking globally or very specific.
Right. So the only difference then would be that in addition to specifying the collection name, we would use the resource identifier as well.
Right.
So we can tell specifically what entity we're working with.
Exactly.
Again, post to create a new one, get to read a specific entity, using put to update that entity, generally in its entirety. Sometimes you can do partial updates as well, or we can use delete to delete our entity.
Right. So going back to our examples that we had earlier, so I could just say post/dogs, and I'm creating that collection.
Yep.
Wow.
We're creating not only the collection, but we're also creating a particular entity in that collection.
Absolutely.
Because basically what we're saying is we don't know what the identifier is. We're kind of assuming in this particular case that the identifier is something that is generated by the back-end system, or, it could conceivably be provided as part of the entity as long as you've got something unique.
Probably not in a real-world situation.
Not in the real world.
But I think the more important point is once we've, in our API design, once we have created this entity, there's also best practices about what we should do, right? Mm-hmm. We need to give the developer that receipt, if you will, that yes, hey, things did happen. And we do that through HTTP as well.
Absolutely. You can see, for example, in this case that we've used the 201 HTTP status code back, which is a convenient way of saying that the resource has been created. And this is actually very consistent with the way that HTTP itself works. The standard actually says whenever you create a new resource that you return the 201 created status code. And so we're overloading, if you will, the HTTP status codes in a way that's very natural.
Right, absolutely. Right? And then the same goes for updating then, right? When we updated dog, we could just use put, provide the information that we're going to be updated within the resource or the collection.
Yeah, so put is a little bit more confusing in that it's kind of a multi-purpose call, if you will. The specification says that if you use put and the entity does not exist, that it will actually create the entity.
Right.
But if it does exist, then it'll actually update the entity, which is kind of what you'd expect.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
So the other thing that's interesting about this too is that there's a concept of doing a full replacement of the entity versus doing a partial update.
Right.
In this particular example, we've just updated the name of our dog. We're going to start calling it Rover now instead of whatever it was previously.
Right.
But we could just as easily have supplied a completely new dog, and the backend server would be assumed to replace the content of that dog, such as it is, with the new content.
Right.
Not exactly how that works, right? but the identifier of the dog, the unique identifier for this particular entity, would remain
the same. Exactly.
Right. And so you can imagine then if we wanted to retrieve that entity after updating it, we could just say give our collection name, our resource identifier, dogs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this case, and there's our dog. and we're using 200 OK to indicate that our API call succeeded.
Right, absolutely.
Makes sense.
And of course, if we wanted to go out and not just get a single resource, in other words, our single dog, for you want both of your dogs to come back, then the same thing applies for the collection as a whole.
Very true. You can also issue a GET request on the collection itself, and it will give you an array of all the dogs that exist in that collection, or an empty array if the collection doesn't exist, or if there's nothing actually in the collection at all.
Right.
So
now we've created a dog, we've updated the dog. I hate to say it because I'm going to get in trouble from all the dog lovers out there. What if we want to delete the dog?
I have to admit, this is kind of where this whole dog thing kind of breaks down. This in retrospect, maybe this wasn't the best domain to be using, but
Right.
we're here, so we're gonna soldier on, right?
Okay.
So let's say that we're deleting a dog. We've decided to
Give it
give
up
the dog to
front.
somebody else.
There
I'm
you
going to
go.
give my dog to you because
Right.
you're a nice guy, right?
Absolutely.
So I'm going to delete this dog from my collection. And in this particular case, we have a couple of different ways to approach the actual response that we get back from this. Java programmers, for example, are familiar with this concept of removing an entity from a collection and getting that entity back as a response to the call. And you can actually do that with APIs as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do that, then you'll receive a 200 OK response, you'll get the entity back in the body,
Right.
and you can go off and do whatever you're going to do, like pass it on to your buddy so he can add it to his collection of dogs, right? But if, for your particular application or your particular domain, it's not appropriate to return that entity, the HTTP specification actually allows you to return a 204 no content, and so you'll get this indication that the dog has been successfully removed from your collection, but you don't see the dog ever again.
Exactly.
So,
well, that's really, I mean, as you can tell, this is why all this whole API thing sounded like voodoo magic. It really is pretty straightforward when you break it down to get and put and post and delete.
these things, you're absolutely correct. I mean, these things are super straightforward, right? And in many ways, this is kind of the beauty of REST in general and the way that Fielding puts some of this stuff together. These operations are super straightforward. They're, for the most part, pretty intuitive. So it's not difficult for a developer to take an API that's designed along these concepts and to be able to use it very successfully.
Absolutely.
Right.
Now, of course, there is one area that gets a little bit more complex.
Complex and controversial both.
So I think we should tackle that. It's called hypermedia, but we'll do that in our next segment.
Let's do it.